Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today we're going to talk about how to transition the world to a sustainable future. A sustainable future is certainly no guarantee at this point. There are simply too many systems broken, both natural systems and man-made. But that's why it's so important for us to envision a sustainable future. For without a vision, we don't have a direction. And without direction, we're just going to wander around until it's too late. We have to envision the future we want, then develop frameworks and treaties to get us there. You know, we spend a lot of time here on the Climate Hour talking about individual action. And there's so many things you and I can do individually to ensure that our lives and that of our families are the best they can be in today's less than sustainable world, but a better world. A better world takes coordinated action at a governmental level. And we've done it before. NATO, the United Nations, the European Union, all examples of governments working together to create a better, more sustainable world. And the United Nations continues to lead in developing policies and frameworks for greater sustainability. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Environmental Program, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. It is the scientists and staff of these and other groups that are our best hope for transitioning to a world with a sustainable future. We're joined today on Zoom by Dr. Laura Patera. Laura is a professor in sustainability transformations and futures with the Global Change Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Stockholm University in Sweden. Laura is an interdisciplinary sustainability scientist. She's trained in ecology and law, zoology, and human geography. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Geography and Environmental Science from the University of Oxford and has worked as a Giorgio Ruffalo and Gundel Fellow in Sustainability Science with the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Laura is currently an Earth Commissioner and a lead author of the Transformative Change Assessment Report by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. She's also a lead author on the United Nations Environmental Programme's 7th Global Environmental Outlook Assessment Report. To all of this, Laura adds an interest in the connection between indigenous local knowledges and innovation, interest in how future techniques and visioning can be used to enable transformative change, and interest in developing innovative methods for knowledge co-production with the Global South. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Bob. Good to be with you today.
For those that may not be familiar with it, can you explain the concept of sustainability, transformation, and futures?
Yes, with pleasure. Even for me, sometimes it can be quite a complicated concept to actually wrap my head around. But in essence, I think we've come to a point, and you mentioned this in your introduction, where we understand that the current systems and structures that we're in are unsustainable. They're inequitable. They're not meeting the needs of people, of nature, of our ecosystems and our societies. And so with this in mind, the idea is that in order to get to a more sustainable, a more aspirational, a more equitable future, we need to fundamentally reconfigure these existing systems. And that's this idea of transformation. So it's not just about adapting or tweaking or some of these small incremental changes. It's about understanding at the systems level something that needs to change from the current state and move into a different state, one that is more preferable for everyone and everything. So in essence, that's the idea of a sustainability transformation. And by default, that requires us to think about, well, what is a more preferable future? What are those states that are actually meeting sustainability, equity, aspirational ideas of where we want to go? And so that's where this combination of futures meets this idea of sustainability transformations.
When you talk about reshaping processes, I mean, what kind of processes? We're talking about businesses, economies. I mean, what are we talking about?
It can literally go from everything from individual levels of how I interact with my neighbor, how I have a relationship with nature around me, how I have a relationship with my community, to how businesses work within communities or within multinational sort of instances, right? And how governments interact with each other. So it literally can happen, those relationships between people and places and ecosystems.
And it's a very, very broad definition. I mean, that covers so much. And you say you're interested in the interface between indigenous local knowledges and innovation. Tell us more about that.
Sure. So I think, if we look historically at the role of science, and it's been really critical in showcasing sort of the problems that we're facing, sort of climate change being a very good example of scientists alerting us to the fact that we were on this pathway and when we didn't know it for ourselves. So there's a really important role of science and technology and innovation. But it has also marginalized many other ways of seeing the world around the world. And so we've sort of got locked into a very Euro-Western, so European Western way of seeing the world. And this has brought a lot of benefits, but it's also brought a lot of the problems that we're currently seeing around us today. And so the idea is of recognizing and understanding that there are many ways of seeing the world, many ways of being in the world that we can actually learn from and appreciate. Sort of many indigenous societies and traditional knowledge systems think about our connection to each other and to nature in fundamentally different ways, ways that we can really learn from, ways that we might want to take into the future with us. And so this idea of being open to more plural understandings and to actually say that maybe we don't have the solution on how, we've caused the problem. Maybe we can't sort of pay our way out of it necessarily. Maybe we need some other way of seeing. And I think this is why leveraging and recognizing those other knowledge systems is a really important aspect of understanding what aspirational futures could actually look like.
I think there's a lot that we can learn from those knowledge systems that we've just forgotten over the decades.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah, I know you've done some work with solving FCB, that Food Climate Biodiversity Network. What kind of work are you doing there, and why is this intersection between those items so important?
Wow. So food, climate, biodiversity, if we manage to sort that out, I think we're well on our way of being able to solve the sustainability problem. My background actually comes largely from working in food systems. And I definitely got to a point where I was like, this is crazy. We're saying the same things 20 years down the line from what I was reading about during my PhD analyses in the 80s. I started to feel like, how are we saying the same thing? We know what the problems are, but we don't really have the solutions. And they're so connected. They're connected to climate driving impacts in our agricultural systems, and then how our agricultural systems are also driving climate change impacts. And so these tight connections, how we've got increasingly less diverse diets in what we're eating. So we're not actually using space, using our food systems as we would have historically to nurture diversity. And so this project really was trying to think through, let's not just think through food, let's not just think through climate or biodiversity. How can we understand these interconnections and also understand how the sustainability or what people would want to see in their food system could be different in different places, right? It doesn't all have to be uniform and the same. And so with this project, we're actually focusing on coastal food systems, so which is another interesting aspect. We tend to break into either terrestrial or marine systems, even though obviously we eat from both of them
Both.
equally. We can't really divide them. And so we've got a series of case studies, one in Costa Rica, one in West Africa between Ghana and Nigeria, one in China, one in the Netherlands, and one with the Tla-Amin nation in Canada. And sort of my particular role in the project, there's a lot of modeling and other sort of data collection analysis happening. But my role has methodologically been to utilize a framework that we developed within IPBES, within the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I will refer to as IPBES from now on.
Thank you.
Sure. Otherwise, we'd just be saying that and the podcast would be over. Sort of using the Nature Futures framework as a framework for trying to understand how people envision different futures within their food systems, understanding the role of climate and biodiversity. and using this framework as a way to say it can be very different in Costa Rica from West Africa, from China. But we have sort of this holding framework to be able to compare and contrast and recognize maybe there are some similarities, maybe there are some differences. And I think the real key thing here is we very rarely ask people what they want, what they aspire towards. And so this is a big focus of this particular project, is to not pretend that we have the answers or the solutions. We obviously have scientific analysis data with us that we're able to bring, but fundamentally asking people, well, okay, in the climate nation, there's a new treaty, there's sort of a focus on food security. So what is it that we can bring? How can we help you understand these connections between climate and biodiversity drivers to move towards where you want your food system to go? And how does that then compare to West Africa, that's facing very different kinds of drivers of change? So that's the underlying rationale behind the project. And it's a 6-year partnership, so we're only halfway through. But it's been really fascinating, even just working with other researchers and academics from such different parts of the world. So really exciting.
Yeah, it sounds exciting. It sounds so core to our systems. I know you had a role in the program on climate smart livestock. Is that part of this program?
So that's not part of this program. That was an earlier project that I was part of actually over COVID, so over 2020, which was
Okay.
obviously not an easy time to be doing any kind of research. But as you can see, there was also this aspect of thinking from the food system, but looking at livestock. And livestock is quite often seen as the problem within climate change. You know, we need to reduce our meat consumption, which is very true, especially those of us who eat far too much meat, to take up far too many resources for our diets. We do need to transition away. But there are also many environments and many cultures around the world that are actually reliant on livestock and agriculture. So you can talk about the sort of the shepherds and shepherdesses within the Pyrenees, for example, that are sort of fundamentally, it's a biocultural practice, right, to actually rear and have livestock in these ecosystems. And the ecosystems have co-evolved with actually needing to have these ruminants, these creatures wandering around. So very similar within the sub-Saharan African context, where grazers are an important part of the ecosystem, where you've got many dry lands, where actually growing horticulture, vegetables, nuts, fruits, these other kinds of sources of important nutrients are just really not sustainable because of water or other kinds of factors. And so what is the role of livestock? Can they still be climate smart in these ecosystems? And can we recognize the cultural practices around sort of seeing livestock actually as wealth in many sub-Saharan African cultures? And to recognize that, yeah, you can't just say get rid of the cattle, because you're not just getting rid of the cattle, you're getting rid of sort of generations of connection to place and people. So can we think through what are the types of grasses that they should be having? Is the boma system, for example, where you sort of corral cattle overnight and then move them around, is that a good way of moving nutrients around within a system? And can we learn, again, there's this link to indigenous cultures and sort of ways of moving around in landscapes, and recognize that actually they've been here for a very long time. These systems and processes have adapted with the landscape, and maybe we can learn from them rather than saying, no, this is what the science says, and you must now go off and do that. So that Climate Smart Livestock project, which was mainly based out of ILRI in Nairobi, was another important sort of food systems meets climate and biodiversity and sort of cultural indigenous knowledge systems.
So that's adding an equity component to the intersection between these sciences, these areas. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. I know you've also, what else did I see? Center for Food Policy at University of London. What was that like?
So that was an interesting time in my career. So I'd been in the UK studying, and then in the US doing a postdoc. Then I went back home to South Africa, and was realizing that actually many of the opportunities, funding, grants, etc., were still sitting in Europe for me. So how could I think of working at home in South Africa, which is where I'm from, the continent that I love, that is often sort of sidelined quite often in these processes, and how could I leverage the resources that we were seeing in Europe to do some work back home. And so I took up this postdoc at the Center for Food Policy, which was run by Professor Corinna Hawkes at the time, who is just an incredible human. I think she's moved over to the FAO at the moment. And this was the first time that, I'd worked in governance, I'd said I'd done this, but I was actually dealing with policy. And I realized very quickly that I'm actually not a policy person at all. So I had a postdoc who was sort of like doing an analysis of all the policies related to food systems in South Africa. And, by policy 99, I was like, wow, okay, yes, this is really connected. But looking through documents, chatting through those specificities, I realized I much preferred working either at that participatory level of sort of getting people to think through ideas, to action ideas, or trying to situate that work in the more theoretical academic way of seeing. But it was really good because it also allowed me to notice and see all of the important policy work that does go on out there, and how that is ultimately where many of those institutional failings that we were talking about earlier, many of them actually lie in the fact that we don't really go back and look at policies. We just come up with new ones, and then they can sort of run counter to what we actually want to achieve. And we never look at, well, what would integrated food policy look like if it wasn't just, here we deal with climate, here we deal with agriculture, here we deal with fishing, here we deal with transport, here we deal with competition within supermarkets. It's all very, very disparate. If we started to reformulate and think institutionally, how do we make decisions at the government level, right? That sort of society needs to follow. Can we do this in a more innovative way? So I think that's what I learned from my time in the Center for Food Policy, but also that, yes, maybe that was not the main focus that I needed to make of my career.
Let's jump over to, talking about climate, let's jump over to climate tipping points. What can you share with us about tipping points?
Wow.
It's a
Okay.
big subject.
This might need its own podcast.
Yes.
But so when we think about, let me take it from the transformations angle. So when we think about the idea of systems change, transformation, going from one system state to a more preferable system state, when we think of sustainability transformations, similar kinds of complex systems dynamics are at play when we think about climate tipping points. So these had sort of historically from, I think it was 2008, 2009, when Tim Lenton sort of led a group based out of the UK looking at climate tipping points. And this was a really important refocus of the climate conundrum that we face, because we'd seen, okay, climate change is leading us to obviously increased temperatures, changes in precipitation and rainfall, increase in extreme events, right? But it hadn't really unpacked some of those almost cumulative, what we would call non-linear dynamics in the system. And so you have some of these key system processes, for example, the Amazon rainforest, that is a really critical ecosystem that maintains climate, that maintains the ability to absorb carbon dioxide, etc. And so if that were to reach a climate tipping point where it was no longer able to play that role within the climate system, right? So you see climate driving it to this different state where it can't do those things. You have these cascading impacts in the rest of the system, and you can't go back. You don't just suddenly get an Amazon rainforest back if you replant things, right? This is not a simple reversible process, right? So it's this question of systems dynamics that lead to this tipping point that you can't reverse. And that was sort of where some of these really critical science was done in terms of, well, what are those tipping points? Is it 1.5 degrees, which they say is for coral reefs, where, you just don't get them back. There's a big question at the moment around what we call AMOC. I won't say the full word because it's meridian ocean circulation. It's but in essence it's how in my very layman's terms, how you circulate, how in the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, you have heat circulating from the tropics to the north. And it's the reason that Northern Europe can actually be a vaguely decent place to live, right? Because you have some of that warmth circulating through. And the potential for with the one of the many mechanisms, but one is sort of the melting of ice caps, for example, in Greenland, sort of changing the salinity dynamics, anyhow, stopping some of that overflow of turn. And so if that were to break down, for example, at what temperature is that could have severe repercussions for the whole of the North Atlantic, right? In terms of being able to, so these were these climate tipping points that were started to put forward. And so then the question comes, well, how do we address these? How do you address not just the climate problem, but some of these really imminent threats, right? That sort of have these nonlinear components to them. And obviously the main thing is just address climate change, right? Like you need to do these things that is just sort of stopping the release of fossil fuels. But then there's this, in the latest tipping point, also thinking through, but if you have some of these nonlinear dynamics in these biophysical systems, you could also have them in social systems, right? We also have tipping points in social systems where once we reach a threshold, you can actually start to potentially address some of these issues. So that's where some of the latest work has been around, for example, using sort of public transport, right, as a tipping point, moving away from individual vehicles. So how do you actually get this collective momentum that we can use? We understand the similar dynamics are playing out within social systems, and there's a whole lot of different work that we've been doing around also understanding that there are inherent risks and inequalities that could be perpetuated in some of these nonlinear dynamics and social systems that we need to be very aware of. Again, coming back to let's not use the same tools and mechanisms that cause the problem to try and solve it sometimes, because that might just land you in a worse state. So it's been really interesting and I think really critical because of the timing components and because, you know, a small nudge could have really big effects and that's what you want. But sometimes those effects could come with potentially worse outcomes. And so we need to be very, very cognizant and I think humble in terms of the interventions that we're using to stay these away. Sorry, as I said, I could have done an entire podcast on tipping points.
Absolutely. And we've done entire podcasts on sea level rise and many of those tipping points. So I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Those social interactions you're talking about, the equity dynamics. I recently read your article on Earth system dynamics, tipping points, risks, equities, and the ethics of intervention. I mean, I think that's what you're addressing there. Can you talk a little bit about how equity and justice needs to be looked at in the context of these tipping points?
Sure. So I think the urgency of the biophysical climate tipping points, right? You know, once you go over 1.5, you don't get these systems back. It adds this extra layer of you can't just fix this problem in 2050 once you have a renewable energy system, right? Once you've gone over this threshold, it's too late, right? So this quite often escalates, understandably, the types of interventions that are then that then open up, right? So it can be a lot more drastic. And many of those are, you know, as I said, not just about solve the problem that we've always known we needed to solve, which is reduce fossil fuel sort of consumption. It can also be about, well, how do we capture some of this extra carbon? How do we change some of these dynamics, right? So there's everything from marine carbon dioxide removal, and I think we've heard about other kinds of climate engineering, whether it's sort of sulfates into the air or everything to a big mirror in space to reflect light, sun back, you know, so all of these kinds of mechanisms that yeah are on the table and we need to grapple with them. And I think that the big question is, by doing this, what are the other risks you might be sort of opening up? So yes, you might be capturing carbon in your marine ecosystem, but that might destroy a marine ecosystem, right? So are you willing to lose that in your quest to actually address this climate conundrum? So it starts to put to the fore some of the values that we have. What is it that we value? What is it that we're willing to sacrifice to avoid some aspects in order to gain? And by recognizing this, are there then alternatives that open up? So I mentioned, for example, public transport, and that was very important because generally the tipping point that's mentioned is the shift to electric vehicles. right? And that you're seeing that as almost a social tipping dynamic, right? That we're moving away from petrol or gas-based to electric vehicles. But those batteries don't come from nowhere, right? The role of critical minerals, rare minerals, that sort of the race. One could largely attribute the wars going on in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, right, is around critical minerals. It's around cobalt, and so. You're looking at deep sea mining being another sort of frontier of, can we sort of maintain this ban on deep sea mining? Because again, what is it we're willing to lose? Yes, you can go, you can mine, you can come up with these batteries, and here that is a solution. If you're just looking at carbon, right, that is one, very, very good solution. But it means you're then willing, to destroy unknown habitats, to sort of trade off against these other things. And so can we sit back and say, well, maybe actually electric vehicles that sort of maintain a system of, I still have a car and we still need roads and I need to get from A to B individually, and that's never going to be equitable because we're never going to be able to produce a car for everyone in the world to be able to have access to it. I mean, there's just not enough material out there, particularly critical minerals, for this. Or is the main thing that I need to be able to get from point A to point B, right? And if a mass transport system allowed me to do that, and we put electric batteries into the mass transport system rather than electric vehicles, that would enable a much, I think, more equitable transition, for example. So it's about, well, what is it? Are we just substituting, or can we actually think of a very different system state? So it comes back to this idea of transformation. And by unpacking some of those ethical questions, some of those interventions, and what we might be risking in other parts of the world and other ecosystems with those interventions, hopefully allows us to be more creative, more imaginative in the types of solutions that we need to come up with. And I think this is also really sitting increasingly at the work we're seeing between the IPCC and IPBES, for example, right? Sort of IPCC having been very much understandably focused on climate. And increasingly you saw over previous assessment reports moving into the social, moving into biodiversity and nature and equity and justice. And IPBES doing similar kinds of things, is that ultimately you can't just sort of focus on your narrow road, because there are going to be impacts elsewhere. And we need to make, sort of coming back to what you said at the beginning, a collective decision as to what it is we value and what we do want to take with us going forward, and what we're willing to sacrifice or lose in our quest for maintaining our current systems.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Laura Pateria about how to transition the world to a sustainable future. Let's talk a little bit about technique, if we can. How do we do these future visioning and stuff? I mean, in your case, how do you incorporate climate scenarios and modeling into your work?
Sure. So I think number one, there's an entire discipline around futures thinking, anticipation, that we tend to not draw on as much as I think we should within the more natural sciences, climate, biodiversity, etc. And I've learned a lot from people who've been facilitating scenarios, futures thinking. And let's go back historically and think through the first, I think, famous set of scenarios was actually Shell scenarios in the 70s, right? Thinking, oh, we're hitting peak oil. What do we do as a company? How do we need to think about these futures in order to make better decisions now? Right. And I think that's still largely the case. Why we think about the future is so that we can make better decisions in the present, this idea of anticipatory governance. And so we were pretty good within the environmental sciences of thinking through extreme drivers, right? So if it were to go into a world that was very, very geopolitically polarized, right? This is the kind of future that might emerge. Or if we went into a very sort of unipolar kind of world, this is sort of the types of dynamics that will play out. And based on that, what would climate sort of change look like? What were some of the solutions or impacts on the environment be? So we're quite good at opening up those potential futures. What we've been less good at, and this is recognized it was a 2016 report, one of the first that IPBES actually put out on scenarios and models, is that we're a little bit less good, particularly at the global level, of what we call normative or target seeking scenarios. So actually understanding, well, if we got things right, what would this actually look like, right? So we have these targets, we've got the Paris Agreement, we've got the global biodiversity sort of framework that with specific numbers and targets that we model towards. But we're very bad if we close, and I do this quite often, I ask everyone to just close your eyes and imagine the world at 2100 and we got everything right. We achieved the SDGs, we achieved the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Framework, we achieved the Paris Agreement. What does the world look like? And that's really, really hard to imagine. Sort of how do people interact with each other? What do our cities look like? What is transport? Some of those really granular aspects. It's not just a number that, oh yeah, we can model the energy system to look like that and we can achieve that target. It's much more visceral. And so this is the area that we've started to play with within IPBES is about, okay, if you put sort of also nature as the focus, and you think through what is an aspirational future? What is it that people actually want? What is this normative target seeking idea? Because we're also all different. If we were the same, the world would be a very boring place, right? But we tend to pretend, particularly in global models, that it's a uniform endpoint that we're all trying to achieve, that we don't take difference or diversity or plurality into account. And yet that's very much the bedrock of what makes this world such a dynamic, wonderful place to be in, right? And so instead of sort of working against this difference, we just, this is a process of trying to understand that we can be different, we can aspire to different things, but we can still move in this direction rather than the one that we're currently on, right? Which is not actually meeting anyone's objectives ultimately, right? Because we're eroding the very bedrock upon which sort of society has been cultivated. And so that requires participation. It can't just be experts sitting in a room coming up with a bunch of dynamics. But also you can't do a participatory workshop with the whole world, right? So how do you start to cut this cake in different ways? And so we've played around with a variety of different techniques. We've done participatory workshops, sort of with key stakeholders, trying to not be representative, but trying to have different perspectives from the global level. We've done it in very focused local sort of environments, I did a project in the Ngoni Kingdom in the north of Malawi, for instance, with the set of the chiefs and the Nkosi Amakosi, the king. So sort of very specific to that group. And what are we learning from that? It's not indicative of everyone in Malawi, but there's some really different ways of thinking about the future that are embedded in different cultural practices that can help us think about some of these alternatives that I was mentioning earlier. We've used speculative fiction, science fiction prototyping. So my colleague Andrew Merry has a really amazing website called Radical Ocean Futures, where we started to put up some of these speculative fiction scenarios and sort of getting people, they're not going to read the scientific paper, but they might read a short story, a sort of a short science fiction story, or to look at artwork, or to play a game. We've got another one called Survive the Century, which has the En-ROADS climate simulator underlying, and literally, you're an editor, and it's a choose your own adventure. Can you survive the century? What are some of those really hard decisions that you need to make? And things where you do something in the 2030s. And it's only in the 2060s that you realize, oh, wait, I made that decision back here. And now this means that I can't change things, so to get people to think a little bit more about some of those long-term effects and lag effects. So there are a variety of different tools and techniques that we've used. And I think we've gotten to a point where we're starting to understand a little bit more about that diversity, a little bit more about what those visions could actually look like. Coming up with stories, artworks, where we're also hopefully trying to engage a little bit more in the broader discourse, sort of that people on a day-to-day basis, not just us as scientists are engaging with, but Ooh, this is a really interesting story. This is a narrative. I want to talk more about this. So we had a short anthology from those Malawi workshops that sort of made it onto reading book lists, right? Sort of where everyone was like on Facebook or on WhatsApp just saying, okay, and like this is download, and we're going to take it into our Wednesday reading club. So what's getting out to people that we never engaged with before, and they were sort of able to grapple with some of these stories. And I think now the next frontier is sort of not just those visions that we have, but what do we need to do in order to get there? So what are some of the actions that need to be taken? What are the pathways towards those futures? And that's also where some of the modeling starts to become important, because we can look at you can tell a story, but actually, as soon as you put some biophysical limits onto that, it allows some aspects, but it also says some other are just biophysically impossible. And so working together with modelers has been important, but then also to recognize that some of these things we value, we can't put numbers to, right? A lot of these relational connections, which it was a central part of the IPBES process, but which has been quite difficult to come up with. What is the proxy variable, and can we measure it? And do we measure it enough at the global level to be able to put it into an integrated assessment model? That's been the ongoing change. So to see what we need to quantify, what actually needs to stay within the qualitative, but which is still useful in the qualitative. Like you don't have to model everything, and that's also fine. So I think that's sort of the space that we're grappling with at the moment, and it's a core part of the work that I'm doing within the Earth Commission at the moment.
Earth Commission, yes. And I think that's so powerful within the future techniques, that visioning, where you do create a film or a story or something to let the layman look at that and see what that future looks like. I think that's a very powerful tool. And that gaming thing you talked about. I'm curious, when you're envisioning a future path and you have interaction with the user where they get to make decisions, are you capturing that data and see how people are reacting to that future?
We have done some. So I've actually got a postdoc who is a conservation psychologist, and she has obviously much better methodological understanding on what is going on cognitively when people are making
Mhm.
those decisions. So we don't have it en masse yet. I've done it more in an ad hoc way with my students, for example, but I think setting up a much broader, actually sort of replicable experiment per se would be really, really important. So there is some other work that I haven't done, but that I have read about, which was looking at people's reactions to, for example, reading speculative fiction stories or reading climate fiction, for example, and sort
Mhm.
of 6 months down the line, does it change? Are you still thinking about these things? Yeah, but this how do you measure that imaginative capacity or that anticipatory capacity that you are or are not building by producing these things? And I think the big question that we have that is sitting at the frontier is not just, as I said, this participatory process where I think we do measure. So at the beginning, at the end, sort of further on, how going through this process has allowed you to think in different ways or to make different connections, etc. I think we're pretty good from that method perspective. But, you can't take everyone into a workshop. And so by producing that outcome, that game, that film, that story, being able to measure that sort of 1 degree removed from the process impact, I think is really where we're sitting at the moment. And hopefully we can come back in a couple of years' time, and I can answer that question for you.
I would look forward to that. I'm going to wait for the game to appear on my computer or phone, and we'll just play the game, and you'll be collecting the data, and we'll have some results in a couple of years.
Perfect. Sounds like a plan.
You talk about imaginatory and imagination. I can imagine how important that is to this process of envisioning the future. What
Yes.
about, yeah, you mentioned anticipatory. What about anticipatory governance?
So again, it's all of the things that I was saying around these complex systems dynamics and non-linearities and how things are irreversible once you sort of cross the threshold. And all of these complex systems dynamics ultimately mean what we already know, which is that the future is uncertain. right? Um, and so with this fundamental understanding, no matter how good your model, no matter how good your understanding, we're not Nostradamus, right? We're not even our economic models. And this is a really interesting part, right? Because economics can say, oh no, but this is how the economy works. I'm like, you can't tell me what food prices are going to look like next week. Why are you telling me you can by 2050, you know? So working in complex and sometimes chaotic systems, we need to get better with uncertainty, being able to still act despite the fact that the future is uncertain, but that we can imagine where we want to go, what some of those drivers or those surprises might be, right? So it's not about saying I'm going to prepare for this exact change driver, but going through a process where, ooh, this is a surprise. Oh, that's something different, helps you actually make more robust decisions in the present. And I think that's about this anticipatory capacity. It's about being able to use futures, think through different things, think through some of these surprises that might emerge. We talk about black swans quite often, right? As sort of these, you know, sort of unlikely but with high impact kind of events. They talk about black elephants too, which is like actually it's the elephants in the room, right? And that, you know, you look back and like, oh, well, we actually knew that was happening, but it came as a complete surprise to us kind of thing. I think a lot of the movements that we've seen over the past years from Roads Must Fall in South Africa, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all of these kinds of movements that we've seen have largely been, in retrospect, oh yeah, that's not actually that surprising, right? But at the time, they seem to be quite different. And there's another aspect that they call sort of black jellyfish, which is this idea of just like this complete takeover of, you know, it's the apocalypse and these are the jellyfish that have come to take over, right? And how to avoid those kinds of futures. So yeah, just thinking through surprise, thinking through this uncertainty and how you can still make good decisions knowing that the future is uncertain. But there are also obviously some things we definitely do know about the future. For example, climate change is driving these particular kinds of impacts, and we need to address that. And so I think that's where that anticipatory governance and is tightly paired, right, to imaginative capacities, actually. Yeah.
Of course, I think that's interesting. You're obviously envisioning a sustainable future, but you're also envisioning the disasters and how do we get out of those.
Yeah, exactly.
I know you recently co-authored a piece titled "An Aspirational Approach to Planetary Futures." I think that was in
Yes.
Nature. How you proposed I mean, I was fascinated by the article. You proposed a new nature relationship index to
Yes.
work alongside the Human Development Index. I think that's such a great idea. Talk about that.
Sure. So this, I must say, is down to the lead author, which is Earl Ellis, working together with the Human Development Program, who actually looks at the Human Development Index. And just, you know, he was saying that it had always frustrated him that we kind of see as humans having a negative impact on the environment, but actually we relate to nature. It can also be positive. It can be a good thing. And actually, from what I was really excited about was about being able to recognize those places in the world that are sitting low on the Human Development Index because it's about these particular things that we measure as this is development, and you need to be able to do these things in order to thrive. But that have very functioning environments and ecosystems and connections to nature, which we've largely lost in much of the sort of like urbanized sort of Western world. And to recognize that these might also be important aspects of development, and that if we think about what we're aspiring towards, we need to actually take all of these things into account, right? And that they shouldn't be seen as trade-offs or counter to each other, right? That you can have a thriving human who meets development in a positive way, not in sort of the way that we've started to box it, that is also sitting in a very thriving environment, right? And that's largely what we need to work out how to do if we're going to have a sustainable planet. So this was trying to look at, again, it came back to those challenges I mentioned earlier in terms of, well, if you need an index, you need to be able to measure it, and you need to be able to measure it at the country level globally, right? So there was a great idea that then resulted in a lot of proxies, and there was an amazing team sort of trying to find these different data sets and to see what could actually work best. But yeah, I think it was sort of putting forward this idea that we also need to think about those relationships that we have with nature, and that is an important component of development, and that we need to recognize this if we're going to move towards a more thriving planet where people and nature are able to flourish.
Yeah, I love it anytime something reinforces the positives, the things we're doing right. We
Yeah,
spend so much
exactly.
time worrying about the problems, and legitimately so, but we need that kind of positive validation to move forward. Let's talk about some of the other, just touch on some of the other many things you're doing. Tell us about your work as an Earth Commissioner and the Earth System boundaries.
Sure. So it's been an amazing group. So it's the second round of the Earth Commission. So the first round sort of was co-chaired by Ewan Rockstrom and Joyita Gupta. And this was really many people have heard about the planetary boundaries, sort of like the set of sort of the climate, sort of biodiversity, nitrogen, etc. systems, again, across which, this is a safe operating space. This is where we can still flourish. On the other side of this, we're beyond this threshold. We're no longer doing well. We need to go back within the safe. But then it was Kate Rayworth actually with her donut economics that was realizing, well, yes, there are these planetary boundaries in the biophysical sense, but we also have really important justice aspects in terms of we need to be using some of uh, these ecosystem goods and services, right? Or these planetary sort of systems to be meeting needs, right? And in many places around the world, we're not actually meeting those needs. And in many other places of the world, those are the reasons that they're driving us to go over these thresholds, right? So excessive amounts of consumption, where we're not actually sitting within an equitable sharing of the planet's biosphere and resources. So this was really the idea behind the safe and just Earth system boundaries, which was to recognize, okay, safe and just from a threshold perspective. In the first round of the Earth Commission, for example, they said for climate, the 1.5 degrees, right, was kind of seen as the safe boundary. And across that, you start to see impacts on coral reefs, etc. But they realized that actually a safe and just boundary would be at 1 degree, because actually the amount of lives lost and suffered from extreme events, etc., across 1 degree was actually what they called unacceptable levels of harm, right? And so you're coming into that really interesting delineation from a justice perspective of, what is an acceptable level of harm, right? You could arguably say that 0 degrees is actually where we should be, So this was really, really fascinating to work with. That's at the upper boundary. In this next round, we're focusing a little bit more also at what we're calling the floor. So what is the basic sort of set of resources that people need, not just to escape from poverty, but also to thrive, right? So we sort of set two different levels of, how much energy does someone need, or how much sort of access to food, water, etc. And the idea is that, this gives you a corridor of the safe operating space, right? Of, this is the minimum amount that we need to be thriving as humans. And this is kind of the boundary at which the planet is still able to thrive. And we have this corridor in the middle. And how can we shift our systems from very much outside the threshold at the moment back into the safe and just space? So that's the work that I've been working on in the second iteration, is what are the kinds of transformations, what are the pathways that are getting us from being outside, sort of in this sort of, let's not overshoot, in the sort of beyond the thresholds of these different boundaries, and how do we start to come back into a safe operating space? And that requires very sort of many different types of interventions. And we've been working with the other Earth Commissioner co-leads, Keiwan Riai from IASA and Detlef van Vuren from PBL in the Netherlands. And then we have a fourth colleague Alexander Popp from PIG, all of them modelers, and then I'm sitting here with my social science qualitative hat on, sort of trying to think through, well, what are the mechanisms? Is it about redistribution? Is it about, well, those in the top 1 to 4% that are having this much of an impact, if you shift that to the bottom, actually are able to meet needs? Or is it more about technology will allow us to bring everyone up to this sort of central part? So we just need to look at sort of better technological provisions or sort of more efficient agriculture, for example. And playing around with those different ideas. And then what's been a really interesting thing that we've had to contemplate there's a justice, equity, and governance group. And this is, at some point you need to define what is an acceptable level of inequality, right? How narrow is that corridor? Everyone needs to be the same versus, how much of your meeting needs versus but you're not yet over consuming, right? Like, what is that difference? What can we find as acceptable? And obviously, it's different in different parts of the world. So we've been grappling with those, I think, actually, ultimately very practical questions, right? That is not often played with in the global environmental space.
Talk to me about gastronomical landscapes. I'm kind of fascinated with that.
Sure. So this harks back to, as I said, my time working on food systems, which still comes back every now and again, not just focusing on futures and biodiversity. And this was about, again, it was metrics. I spent my PhD getting quite frustrated at the fact that, we were measuring food security. Yes, we looked at it, opened it from not just availability of food, but sort of access and affordability and sort of nutritional utilization and cultural appreciation. But you still, instead of saying, oh, we need 2,000 calories per person, and those calories could literally come from eating the same bowl of what we eat in South Africa. It's called pap, maize meal, right? Which is the staple food for everyone. You can get your calories from just eating the same bowl of maize meal every day. We also need nutrition, right? So we can fortify that maize meal in some way, right? But that's not cultural, right? That's not the reason that we sit down as a meal collectively together, or what, when I think of food is like, oh, what my mom would cook for Easter, right? The lamb, that is very significant, right? And it also completely disrupts the relationship to place, right? Or to where that food is coming from, or to the people that have actually worked the land to get that food onto our plates, right? And so it was this question of how do you reconnect people to the food system, or reconnect them to the biosphere that's providing the food in the first instance, and then to the hands that are cultivating or processing. And I loved working with chefs because they, it's at that point, like, why can't everyone sort of recognize cooks and chefs? When we're talking about poverty, it's just like this line of you need to tick these boxes and you'll be fine. It's like, actually, no, we should be talking about sort of culturally appropriate foods and like cuisines, not just, calories. And so this was where the idea of gastronomic landscapes and seascapes came in. It was about recognizing that if you're going to have a more functional biosphere, or a biosphere that's stewarded, you need to think about these spaces not just as sort of these industrial sort of pits of, the more you can get out of this inch of soil, the better. But to think about it, you're eating from this. This is a gastronomic landscape or a seascape, how you would have looked maybe historically as hunters and gatherers in these landscapes. And the coast of Southern Africa is largely where hominids actually evolved, right? Because of the rich sources of protein that we had around mollusks, etc., along the coast. But we've lost that food system completely in the Western Cape of South Africa. And so thinking about this, this is not just a production landscape. It's gastronomy. It's about how I put things together, which is history and culture and identity and taste and excitement. It's not just about the calorific outputs or the nutritional aspects, which are obviously important. But it was working with chefs and really thinking through how we could reimagine again how we see these places to build more of a connection.
I love the idea of working with chefs to figure out how we eat. And IPBES. That's just brilliant. You were recently at the Third United Nations Ocean Conference in Nice, France.
I
You
was.
helped you helped launch the International Platform for Ocean Sustainability. Tell us about that.
Yes, so this was also a group of people that had been of ideas that had gone around for a while. Sort of did we need an IPCC for the ocean was the big question, right? And we do have the World Ocean Assessment, and so there was this recognition that that fulfills a particular role. And so over many years, and I sat on the advisory board for IPOS, for this new panel for ocean sustainability. And it was recognized that actually what we needed more was a trusted platform of knowledge. And I'm saying knowledge because it is both scientific and this recognition that diverse knowledge systems are also important in this, where you could actually ask some of these questions. So in a similar way to governments would go to IPBES and say, we want an assessment on transformative change, right? Which we've just had. We also had the Nexus assessment. So like we're grappling with these questions. Can you give us the state of the science on this? The idea behind IPOS was similar, but a little bit more targeted. So it wasn't this big, expensive, because it's very expensive to do these intergovernmental processes, because you need, obviously, every country needs to agree and they need to nominate their authors, and it takes, 4 to 5 years. It's not particularly nimble. Could they learn from that and set up a platform for questions around the ocean that could be a little bit more of a rapid response? And there are a variety of different mechanisms for how the platform's functioning, and it's actually now kicking off its first pilot test phase to see sort of whether this works, whether we have enough sort of questions from countries that are coming up, whether we have enough capacity to sort of deliver and answer some of those questions. So it's sitting at that point at the moment, but it was really focusing on the fact that, yeah, the ocean gets left behind a lot. And actually, we need to recognize that it's 2/3 of our planet, and that we need to really be much more concerted in how we think about it, and not just our coasts, right? The high seas and all the agreements we have around that too.
High seas. I understand why 50 countries ratified the High Seas Treaty. So we're getting
Yes.
close to implementing that.
Exactly. So getting close, and I think sometimes I work on preferable futures, but I also have to be a little bit like, okay, they signed it. Are they going to change their behavior around it now? But that's still for us to keep fighting for.
Indeed, keep fighting. So thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about you or your work, whatever you want to send people to?
Sure. So I think, I've mentioned a few of the platforms that we've been on, but I think the project that's closest to my heart at the moment is the Future Ecosystems for Africa project, which is my main project based at Wits University, the Global Change Institute. And that really has a flavor of all of the things that I've been talking about, whether it's improved sort of numbers and modeling, participatory work, some of the speculative fiction is up there. So but with a focus on the African continent, which is quite often left out of discussions, discourses, even just data. And so to really center that, so that for me is probably where most of my work is being reflected at the moment. And then obviously there are links from that through to the Earth Commission or through to IPBES Nature Futures Framework, etc.
Do you have a web address for that?
futureecosystemsafrica.org. Yes.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.